to allow us to start the discussions. Excellencies, dear colleagues, friends, first of all, good morning. We opened the curtains to allow some of the sunlight, thanks to my colleague from the Netherlands, to remind us also of the topic of today, the climate, and to let in a little bit the sunshine that we still have before the winter will come. Welcome to Geneva, and welcome to this first ever climate science and humanitarian dialogue. We are here today to unpack the findings of the Ipcc special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. What would an increase of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius mean for the lives of the most vulnerable people in the world? To address such an important question, we invited representatives of states, scientists, humanitarian experts, and academics from all geographic areas. This event has been prepared and will be conducted in the spirit of the Talanoa dialogue. We are here to learn from one another, to share stories, and to get inspired by ideas and experiences in a positive environment. The humanitarian impact of climate change is growing. More and more people are affected by the impact of climate change in their everyday lives. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN recently published a report stating that climate variability and extremes are a key force behind the recent rise in global hunger. In its new institutional strategy, 2019 to 2022, published last month, the ICRC states that, and I quote, "Short-term humanitarian problems caused by conflict and violence are made worse by longer-term trends like climate change," unquote. The number of people forced to flee their homes because of floods, because of tropical storms, droughts, and other hazards has never been so high as today. In Switzerland, glaciers will lose 3/4 of their mass by the end of the 21st century, causing a serious impact on water supply. These are just a few examples, but they show us how addressing climate change must be a priority. We owe it to the vulnerable people who are disproportionately affected by the many impacts of climate change. The recently released Ipcc special report is alarming. We need to increase our efforts to mitigate the risks and to adapt to the challenges. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to the Ipcc authors who are here in Geneva to share their findings with us. As a diplomatic hub and a humanitarian capital, and as the headquarters of the Ipcc, Geneva presents the advantage of providing a unique platform where different stakeholders can meet and exchange on the humanitarian impact of climate change. Next year, related discussions will continue here in Geneva at the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction in May, and at the 33rd International Conference of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent at the end of the year. In addition, Poland will host the COP24 in December this year, and today's recommendations will, of course, feed into all of these conferences. I am convinced that today's discussions will provide us with creative and innovative ideas to address the rise in temperature and the adequate humanitarian response. I thank you all for coming and wish you a fruitful and inspiring discussion. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Her Excellency Monique van Dalen. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Valentin, Ambassador of Switzerland. I'm really pleased to speak to you on behalf of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and I would like to underline the word kingdom, because I'm not representing just the Netherlands in Europe, but also the Caribbean countries, Aruba, Curaçao, and Sint Maarten, and together we are the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And all these 4 countries within our kingdom are seriously threatened by climate change. Roughly 1/3 of the Netherlands lies below sea level. The destructive power of water has been a constant threat for my country throughout its history. Through dikes and complex water systems, we have been able to keep the water out. But if we do not halt the increase of the global temperature, the sea levels will continue to rise, which could have serious consequences for the safety of the people living in the Netherlands. The same goes for the Caribbean countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Aruba, Curaçao, and Sint Maarten. As a consequence of climate change, these small island states will lose land to the sea and experience more extreme hurricanes and inundations with negative effects on their ecosystems. We thus take the threat of climate change very seriously, and we should all take it seriously. Because the Ipcc report, we will hear much more about it today, shows us that basically everywhere in the world climate change will have an impact. And that is why the Kingdom of the Netherlands is so pleased to co-organize today's dialogue, which will focus specifically on the humanitarian consequences of climate change. Because it is a fact that climate change has major humanitarian implications. Climate change will shape tomorrow's humanitarian needs, tomorrow's conflicts, tomorrow's vulnerabilities, and it will shape tomorrow's humanitarian response. We need the worlds of climate change and humanitarian policymakers to work together to face the humanitarian implications of climate change. I look forward to today's dialogue and thank you all for coming. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator of today, Ms. Hiba Ali. Hiba is the director of IRIN News and spent a decade reporting from conflict zones. She is a regular commentator on humanitarian policy, and in 2018, the World Economic Forum named her one of the 100 young global leaders under 40. We're grateful to have you on board, Hiba, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. This topic is of great interest to my organization, IRIN, which is a news service that reports about humanitarian crises and increasingly reporting about the humanitarian implications of climate change. And I was at an event here yesterday organized by the Kingdom of the Netherlands in which a dominant narrative that I took away was that we need a greater understanding of the lived experience of climate change and its humanitarian implications, and that is exactly what we at IRIN tried to do, is to bring to life the stories of the people who are most affected by this. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. I will now introduce to you the next speakers and then walk you through a little bit later the outline of the day. For now, I'd like to introduce Mr. Al-Hajj Al-Si, who you will all know as Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which is not only an umbrella organization of national societies that are on the front lines of the implications of climate change, but also helped establish the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which you'll hear more about later today, and of course is a co-host of today's event. Mr. Al-Si.
Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you very much, Excellencies, friends and colleagues. Well, if we think of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, of course, we first think of our principal humanitarian action, and our fundamental principles, the mother of which is humanity. The only one humanity we all share, like we share the only one planet that we all have. And of course, if we care about people, then we care about the earth, we care about the environment, and de facto, we care about climate. So what does it mean, really for people? Well, the gathering of this room, today, and the variety and diversity of people around the table illustrate, what it is all about. It calls for science, it calls for politics, it calls for activism and advocacy, but it calls also for response, including the humanitarian response, which is about accompanying people to respond to their needs. And then if we have to do that, we have to do that on a long term, and we have to do that across a continuum. And that is key. Through the lens of those people in need, and particularly those who do less to contribute into climate change, but suffer most of the impact of it, it is a continuum, all the way from the mitigation down to the adaptation. Well, maybe we can sometimes be proud on the number of people we reach and then helping them to be more resilient and then to adapt. And if the numbers grow every year, we may see that as a good progress and good achievements, maybe yes. But if we really think about it more deeply, we can ask ourselves, why do we have so many people that will have to adapt more and more every year? So seeing that then that continuum and the synergy, that maybe the best way to adapt is also to mitigate, so that we have less people that will be forced to find ways to do that. Climate change is indeed impacting what matters most to those people, their lives, because for many of them it's a matter of life and death, that simple. And it is also about livelihood, and it is about also dramatically, in many instances, changing the ways of lives of people. So if you're a pastoralist in the Sahel, you know what it is about. If you are in Mongolia, and having, to survive, based on, how climate will be impacting on your livelihood, you know exactly what it is about. If you are right now in, Asia, where most of the weather, related, type of shocks and hazards, are happening, you experience it, in a very empirical way. From a humanitarian point of view, of course, then we'll have to look at it, through that continuum. Better understanding the science, use of meteorological data, to better prepare. Early warning, early action, but also when we respond to make sure that capacity are being built in those communities to allow them to withstand the shocks, that they will be facing. We also call for innovation, in terms of best possible way for adaptation, but also innovation in financing, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. Together with friends of the German, government, the German Red Cross, we're experiencing and championing forecast-based financing in that regard. And it's all about partnership, because none of us alone, can do it. We will have, to partner, first of all, where it matters most at the community level. And when we do that, we pay particular attention, to those who are hardest to reach and that are most vulnerable, to it. Because most of the time, the averages do not cut it. We have to go beyond the average and then look at the inequities and then the level of vulnerabilities that are affecting, most people, depending on not only their socioeconomic status or their gender, but depending simply on the place, where they live, and then they wake up every day to start to try to, survive. And that in this context, the place you were born and you live, will be the most determining factor, of your vulnerability or, your ability and your resilience, in face of it. So, bearing in mind that we always have to not necessarily consider it as the last mile to walk, meaning that we have to walk all the miles and then only then after that last, but then turn it and flip it around and make it a first mile of response, so that we make a difference in the lives of those that are most, vulnerable. We commit, together with our 191 national societies, across the world, and our 17 million volunteers, to be partner, so in that spirit, and most importantly, to continuously accompany those in need, to respond to those needs, to recover not only their livelihoods and preserve their ways of lives, but by so doing, preserve also their human dignity. Thank you very much, for associating us with this, and count on us as partners in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Al-Hajj. I'd now like to introduce Mr. Abdallah Muqsit, the Secretary of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Ipcc, which you will all know very well and has been widely in the news this week. Before joining the Ipcc, I've become dyslexic in my old age. The Ipcc, Abdallah was director of Morocco's Meteorological Service. He's also, or was the third vice president of the World Meteorological Organization, and has also been involved in IPC processes in various capacities, including as one of the vice chairs of the first working group that aims to assess the physical, scientific basis of climate change during the 5th IPCC report on assessing climate change. So sorry with that very difficult introduction. Please, Abdallah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear moderator, and also I should recognize all the panelists. And I'm sometimes a little bit special, because now this meeting is about 1.5 degrees C, special report. And we spent 6 hard days in Incheon to approve this special report. But also I am special because I want to start with giving you the 4 key messages for this special report. And this, because I know you are excellency diplomats, and this is what you can bring to your policymaker and your capital. Climate change is already affecting people, ecosystems, and livelihoods all around the world, all around the world. Second message, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C is not impossible. I am also special because this expression is not impossible. It is a term liked by mathematicians. It is known P. It was also simple to say is possible. So it's not impossible, but would require unprecedented transition in all aspects of society. The third message, there are clear benefits to keeping warming to 1.5 degrees C compared to 2 degrees C or higher. Every bit of warming matters. The fourth assessment, key message is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C can go hand in hand with achieving other world goals, including sustainable development goals. And I think that those 4 key messages are exactly in the line of spirit of the work of IPCC. And I want really to recognize that this work was prepared thanks to scientists, and you have before you our 2 co-chairs of our panel, Valerie and Deborah, and also the work was done thanks to representatives from coordinating lead authors, the drafting team, who worked hard many weeks on a voluntary basis. And this is something we should highlight because the work is there. But what is really strategic and clear here, in this room, you have scientists and you have policymakers. And it is about how we can bring the science voice to decision makers. Scientists are publishing papers, but decision makers are taking decisions for the well-being. Taking decision is mobilizing money, mobilizing human resource, and also taking decision is also reorienting policies. Now, what is really important for this special report, and this is also about the demonstration how IPCC is working. In 2015, in Paris, when we did have this international consensus Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention, invited IPCC to prepare a special report about 1.5, with the objective to make this comparison between 1.5 and 2 degrees C. And I'm happy, thanks to the effort of scientists and also the delegation who were approving the system, we were tasked and we delivered in time, enough time before the COP24 in Katowice. And this is for critical input for this negotiation. Climate science for negotiation. And also, I want also to highlight that there is no sector, no component of society which is left behind and without consideration by IPCC. I want just to draw the attention, one chapter of this special report is related to sustainable development. And for me, sometimes I am summarizing all the work of IPCC, all the engagement for the work is to work in the direction to install well-being for current generation as well for next generation. And you can agree with me, and this is why you have in this panel representative from Red Cross. Red Cross is managing risk, and also humanitarian, and this is also to manage population in difficult situation. And I think, I am sure that the outcome of this special report is about to cause or to introduce a sort of shift and transition between what we were using in the past as crisis management to knowledge risk management. And this is excellent. It is a revolution in the process because managing crisis, it is already there. Introducing knowledge risk management is the anticipation, proactive action. And this is how Red Cross can be more efficient and also how we can anticipate all these extreme events. And just coming this morning from my home, so I was following the news. The last Michael cyclone caused at least 6 dead. 6 dead. Where? In very developed country. That means now extreme events are not treating countries with difference. Each country is facing climate change extreme with the maximum damage. Now also, it is about sustainability. We demonstrated during 1 week that we were able to conclude an internationally agreed summary for policymakers that should be used as a context of robust science to inform negotiators in future Talanoa dialogue. And we hope, and this is the outcome, the serious one, we hope that this input from this special report, as well as all past reports of IPCC, we hope that this report will invite, convince the delegation to raise their ambition, to raise their indices, to push this. I am always giving this branch of 2 degrees or 3 degrees now to make it less than 1.5 to ensure some good impact for many countries, including least developing country, small island, and above all the countries in the world. Lastly, the dialogue is here because this is the work of IPCC, is to manage the good interface between science of climate, policy, stakeholder, all the segments of the population, including students, children in school, minorities, indigenous people, in some countries, rural women. And this is the work of Ipcc. We want really to establish this sustained dialogue to improve the quality of life for the current generation as well as for the future generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdallah, and apologies. I not only mixed up Ipcc, but I've also got something in my throat, so thanks for putting up with my coughing. I will now introduce our next speaker, Mr. Alban Ishoda, and there are fewer words in his introduction that will mix me up, so hopefully this will go a bit more smoothly. Alban is representing the Republic of the Marshall Islands and is based in the Fijian capital, Suva, where the main embassy of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific is based. So he's come a very long way to be with us today. He's also the current chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a forum of 48 countries particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Alban, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you for that introduction. Let me just clarify one part of that. I represent the chair, which is the president of the Marshall Islands of the Climate Vulnerable Forum.
Sorry, I meant that Marshall Islands is the chair, not you personally.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now that relieves a lot of burden from my shoulder. But thank you, Excellencies and colleagues. It is indeed a privilege for me to be here this morning to represent the President of the Marshall Islands in this important dialogue. I think perhaps this may be the first ever climate change, climate science, and humanitarian dialogue that is convening at this level in such a esteemed space. But I can assure you that these kind of conversations have always been happening in the islands between communities, especially those that have already felt the impacts of climate change. And we welcome this dialogue. We welcome the opportunity to be able to say something at least in response to the report that recently came out. And I thank the government of Switzerland, the government of Netherlands, and the other organizers for allowing us the opportunity. I think, if anything, and I'd like to take us back to the conversations that were happening during the Paris negotiations of the Paris Agreement. For the smaller island countries and those that are more vulnerable to these impacts, 1.5 was the ultimate compromise number. We knew that anything over 1 would jeopardize our ability to survive on our islands. But nonetheless, we knew that it was going to be difficult, so 1.5 was always the compromise number. And for us, anything beyond 1.5 is simply uninhabitable. It spells our fate being sealed for many of us. So on that, responding to the report, I think I like to acknowledge the presentation by the Secretary of the Ipcc. I think it's quite clear that limiting emissions is achievable, and I think this is a key point of that statement that was made. It just requires a lot of commitment and unprecedented transition into ensuring that we realize 1.5 and less than 2 degrees in the next couple of years, maybe 2-3 decades. And as this requires the involvement of all the sectors and all the governments and all the stakeholders of the world to deter a humanitarian crisis, as stated by the Secretary General of the IFRC. And I think these are critical messages that needs to be continued to relay across the different platforms. And I can assure you that the Marshall Islands will continue to use the political platforms that it is part of, including the Climate Vulnerable Forum, to continue to highlight and push for greater ambition to reduce emissions from the global sectors that are responsible for this. Also through the other political sectors platforms, such as the High Ambition Coalition, which many of the countries in this room are also a member of. But on other notes, I think the IPCC special report and the summary for policymakers on 1.5 confirmed what many of us feared. But for us in the islands and the more vulnerable communities, it reaffirmed what we already knew, that change was inevitable, and to ensure that the sustainability of vulnerable communities is maintained, a whole paradigm shift, a whole global shift into the thinking of how we address climate change needed to be realized sooner than later. That is why the Marshall Islands, along with Fiji, in the recent Climate Week in New York, announced that both are embarking on a very ambitious 2050 net zero strategy. That is to tell us, I mean, this is, if you think about it, these are countries that rely on fossil fuels for their economies. But we have committed this to ourselves because if we can prove that we can do it, what is the excuse for others not to do it? I mean, this only makes sense for the sustainability of the global world. And we'd like to also demonstrate that we are not here to play victim, but we are here to call for collective solutions amongst all of us as members of this global community. Limiting global warming to 1.5 compared to 2% degrees, 2 degrees Celsius would reduce impacts on ecosystems, human health and well-being, and making it easier to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Again, this is not a silo approach. This is part of other global initiatives that our global leaders have called on. The world has already warmed by 1 degree Celsius now, and on the current trend, it is likely to pass 1.5 degrees mark between 2030 and 2052. And to keep that, emissions would have to be declined by about 45% between 2010 and 2030. That's significant, but again, that is not unachievable. It is something that is achievable. The President of the Marshall Islands considered it particularly important to make the announcement of the Climate Vulnerable Forum Summit of Heads of Government here, which was released on the 27th of June in 2018, and which has had great reactions from leaders around the world. We have confirmed from 40+ heads of governments and representatives of governments to join in a virtual summit, a quite groundbreaking summit that will link all heads of governments and representatives and leaders of governments and organizations virtually to talk and discuss some of the last critical issues as part of a Talanoa process before countries meet up in Poland for COP24. The Republic of the Marshall is made up of over thousands of small islands, only a few feet above sea level, and global warming could raise the Pacific Ocean far above that, which threatens our way of life, but we don't stand alone. Everyone's way of life is under threat. You could sort of view us as your litmus test on what the future of the islands become, or future of the world becomes, if nothing is being done to maintain emissions by at least 1.5 degrees. We welcome other countries to join us for the virtual summit, which will be held in November 22nd next month, to be presided over by the President of the Marshall Islands. Most, if not all, of the Pacific Island countries have agreed to take part at the highest level, including members of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And this is an open invitation to all countries to join us in this event as we march forward to COP24. In closing, Madam Moderator and colleagues, excellencies, may I call on my colleague Akathy to recite a poem that was made by one of our young leaders, young champions in my country, Kathy Jadangal-Kitchener. I'm sure many of you know her, but she has just better articulated the 1.5 degree conversation a lot better than I have in the last couple of minutes. So with all due respect and with your indulgence, may I call on her to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 degrees. The other night, my 1-year-old was a fever, pressed against my chest. We wrestled with a thermometer that read 99.8 degrees. The doctor says, technically, 100.4 is a fever. But I can see her flushed face, how she drops across my lap, listless. Lee Paynham is usually a wobbly walking toddler, old chunks and duck-footed shaky knees, stomping squeaky, yellow light-up shoes across the edge of the reef. And I think, what a difference a few degrees can make. Scientists say if humans warm the world more than 2 degrees, then catastrophe will hit. Imagine North American wildfire increasing by 400%, animal extinction rising by 30%, fresh water declining by 20%, 1,000 million displaced, left wondering what happened. At a climate change conference, a colleague tells me 2 degrees is an estimate. I tell him, for my islands, 2 degrees is a gamble. At 2 degrees, my islands, the Marshall Islands, will already be underwater. This is why our leaders push for 1.5. Seems small, like 0.5 degrees shouldn't matter. Like 0.5 degrees are just crumbs. Like the Marshall Islands must look on a map. Just crumbs. You dust off the table, wipe your hands clean. Today, Lee Paynham is feeling better. She bops around our backyard, drops pebbles and leaves into a plastic bucket before emptying the bucket out and dropping pebbles in again. As I watch, I think about futility. I think about the world making the same mistakes since the Industrial Revolution, since 1977, when a scientist said 2 degrees was an estimate. On Kili Atoll, the tides were underestimated. Patients with a nuclear history threaded into their bloodlines, sleeping in the only clinic on Island Walk to a wild water world, a rushing rapid of salt closing in around them, a sewage of syringes and gauze. Later, they wheeled their hospital beds out, let them rest in the sun. They must be stained, rusted, or people. Creaking brackish from salt spray and radiation blasts. So tired, wondering if the world will wheel us out to rest in the sun, or will they just dust their hands of us, wipe them clean? My father told me that Edic, when the tide is nearest an equilibrium, is the best time for fishing. Maybe I'm fishing for recognition, riding the tides towards an equilibrium, wheeling the world to find its balance, so that people remember that beyond discussions, our faces all the way out here, that there is a toddler stomping squeaky, yellow light-up shoes, walking wobbly on the edge of the reef, not yet under the water.
Thank you, Agath and Albin, for what I think is a very moving reminder of why we're all here today. And I was quite struck by the fact that this is really life and death for some people. I would now like to pass the floor to Ambassador Czech, the permanent representative of Poland, the incoming presidency of COP24.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Distinguished participants to the Climate, Science and Humanitarian Dialogue, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This year, Poland, for the third time, will host the UN Climate Conference. In the city of Katowice, you will see what we have already managed to achieve to date and how much work still remains to be done by the residents of the city and the surrounding areas. I can tell you that today's Katowice is a symbol of change. The city and the whole region are becoming the zone of science, innovation, culture and modern industry. The special Ipcc report unequivocally confirms that we've been already seeing the negative impacts of climate change. I believe the upcoming climate conference in Katowice, the COP24, will be an essential step on the path towards a more sustainable and simply a better future to us all. I deeply believe that the more progress we make in Katowice, the closer we are in the reducing the negative impacts of the global warming upon the communities, human communities, and the natural systems. I am convinced that the COP24 in Katowice will be our joint success, a success of all the parties to the Climate Convention. We hope to adopt a balanced, robust package of decisions in accordance with the Paris Agreement work programme, a package that will meet the expectations of the whole international community. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm now going to ask you to thank our panelists on stage, and we will then move on to the next session. So thank you very much to all the speakers.
You want them?
Can I? Thank you. You can anywhere.
Can I? Is that okay? Yeah. These are the Swiss ones, and these are the foreign ones. They're much stronger. Like always, Switzerland is made of.
The ambassador is giving me tips on cough drops. So I'm going to, at the same time, invite our next group of panelists to come onto stage. And in the meantime, while we do our changes up here, I'm going to explain how we hope to engage with you over the course of the day. So you will all have access to the public Wi-Fi, and through it you can enter into your computers or tablets the website for Mentimeter, which is a tool that we're going to use to allow you to engage with the panelists on stage in a more streamlined way. So on the slides here, you'll see the website and the code that you can use to enter. Now, I just want to clarify, this is the code that allows you to ask questions to panelists throughout the day. So as we go through the conversations, you can go ahead and type in your questions. They will pop up on my screen, and I will try to address them at some point during the discussions. Please do come ahead and join us. Separately, we will try throughout the day to also ask you some questions, and for that you'll have a different code. So we'll come back to this, but do jot it down if you can. The code here is to ask questions to the various panelists throughout the day. And as a way of perhaps testing this, we will in a moment ask you to fill out a poll, and I'll come to that in just a second. I just want to give you the outline of the day first. We will start today with a panel to set the scene a little bit about why we're talking about this topic now, why the links between humanitarian implications and climate change is so urgent. We will then have a look at the report itself, and we have with us today some of the authors of the Ipcc report to help unpack the science behind it. We'll move on to some local perspectives of climate change to help us really connect with the realities on the ground that we're talking about. And then after lunch, you'll have a series of breakout groups that will touch on the humanitarian impacts on key sectors. In the first breakout, the second will look at major trends and their humanitarian implications, and the third will look at solutions for reaching the most vulnerable. Throughout the day, there is a photo exhibit outside in the Serpentine Bar in Building E, which is where lunch will be served. And you're welcome to peruse throughout the day. The photos are really quite stunning of the impacts of climate change in many countries around the world. There's also an interactive video experience in room 7. It's called the 1.5 Climate Cafe, and it gives you an opportunity to listen to the stories of people who are already facing the impacts of climate change. It also gives you the opportunity to share your own stories, and the organizers would love to record as many reflections as possible from you about what 1.5 means. So please do check out the Climate Cafe when you have a minute. It takes about 15 minutes, and it's open all day except for during the breakout sessions. I'm now going to just talk a little bit about what we hope to achieve in the next few minutes with this panel, and then test out your Mentimeter skills. So as we've covered a little bit this morning, we're 3 years out now from the Paris Agreements, which agreed to limit the global warming to 2 degrees, but set this ambition to go further and bring it down to 1.5. And you heard now our colleagues from the Marshall Islands talk about what difference that 0.5 degrees can make. And yet people still think about climate change as though it's something that's going to affect the coral reefs or polar bears in 50 years' time, and not something that is affecting real people today. So we see that every day in our own reporting at IRIN. We've reported about the million Somalis who have been made homeless because of conflict and drought, Senegalese herders who have been pushed into poverty because they're losing their livestock, dried up riverbeds and withered crops that have displaced 250,000 Afghans, the Fijians who've had their roofs blown off their homes and their walls torn away. This is very real, and we're seeing it on a daily basis. So this report comes at a unique moment for this climate change and humanitarian dialogue, and we will focus in this session on where we are now, why this is so urgent, and in the Talanoa style, try to increase the collective understanding of how to move forward. So, as promised, we're going to test your Mentimeter skills, and I'm now going to ask our colleagues to put up the other code, which will allow you to, okay, so with this code, punch it into your Mentimeter login, and you should be now able to answer the question, what are the biggest humanitarian implications of climate change as you see them? And with your results, which we will turn to in a minute, we will be able to get a sense of where the biggest concerns are in the room and have the panelists also respond to that. So while you're putting that, those answers in, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, and we will come back to those results in a few minutes. Ambassador Deo Saran is Fiji's ambassador to Belgium. He is also permanent representative to the European Union and special envoy to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ambassador, you have, of course, led the Fiji, not you. I'll make the same mistake as I did with our colleague from the Marshall Islands. Fiji has led the presidency of COP23, of course, and under that presidency, a dialogue process that I've mentioned, known as the Talanoa Dialogues, has begun to encourage a kind of inclusive, interactive, and constructive dialogue in the lead up to COP24. This topic of the humanitarian implications of climate change, to what extent has that been part of the discussion in this dialogue process, and what kind of messages have been coming through? And, you know, to the extent that you see a shift in, or an inflection point in the moment we're in today, I'd love to see how you'd like to see that change moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, Madam Moderator and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. First of all, how happy I'm here to be part of the COP23 presidency, to be amongst yourself, to share our experiences on the Talanoa dialogue process and also what we have been getting out of it. As you all know, Fiji has introduced the Talanoa dialogue process. Because we felt that process was most appropriate to share the experiences and the views of the parties in the most amicable manner, in a frank manner, that will help us to work towards raising our ambition as we approach the COP24. During our sessions that we have held throughout the year, along with our friends of the incoming presidency of COP24, we have had many stories. Hundreds of submissions addressing the questions of where we are, where do you want to go, and how do we get there have been received through the Tawar Dialogue portal and also in our subsidiary meetings in May in Bonn. More than 305 parties and non-party stakeholders participated in these discussions. The process of sharing stories based on guiding questions was indeed helpful to build mutual trust and confidence among parties and demonstrate the value of working together and learning from experiences of others. Whilst there remains to be a lot of submissions still open, I encourage all of you to make those submissions by the 29th of October, I believe, before we go into the political phase at the COP24, where the ministers will gather together and have a thorough dialogue of their own in addressing the issue of how do we raise a mission, answering the third question as to how do we get there. So in this context, we had, and coming back to the subject of today's session, on the humanitarian phase of the dialogue was very, very heartwarming, and also when we started sharing the experience, because predominantly all the submissions that came through reflected upon how their communities and people were already suffering. So it was so appropriate and so befitting to put that context into the dialogue process. So we see the humanitarian phase as a very important element of the dialogue process and going into the COP24, because this is where we try to relate to what the effects of climate change to the people. It is the humanitarian phase. So I really thank the organizers for choosing this topic and also giving this space to bring that element into the dialogue process, which of course you know is just one of the elements apart from the Ipcc report, which is the science aspect of it, that we need to feed into our negotiations and also in our raising of ambitions at the COP24.
Can I just follow up with you, Ambassador, with another question? You, of course, like many of the other countries in your region, have been pushing for the interests of small island coastal states. To what extent does this report kind of validate that effort that you've been making in terms of what it says about the impacts in your region in particular?
Like all of the other parties and constituencies, so we have been saying that we will need to come to 1.5 for the last 20 years, right from Rio. And really, during the Suva Declaration in 2015, that was one of the really outcomes from the Pacific region, that the minimum is 1.5. And it is so reassuring to see that the Ipcc report reinforces that the 1.5 is what the target, minimum target should be. Whilst that is, of course, falls far, whilst our current NDCs fall far short of that, even the current Paris Agreement goals of 2 degrees, the encouraging part is that, as we have already heard, is that the science tells us that the 1.5 degrees is achievable. That is very reassuring. And not only that, science also tells us that the 1.5 degrees is achievable while sort of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. There's the other important dimension to it. And in this context, I would like to make also a very telling observation that has been put together by the European Commission. They've analyzed the results and plotted the graph over the last 40 years for the economic growth and the increase in the carbon emission. And it is quite evident that the two can be decoupled. And that provides a business case that has been a concern for many of the corporates, that we could achieve a reduction in the carbon emission while increasing the growth.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I want to turn now to why climate change is a growing concern for humanitarians in particular. To my left is Caroline Kende-Robb, the Secretary General of CARE International. She was previously Chief Advisor to former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown at the Education Commission, and from 2011 to 2016 was the Executive Director of the Africa Progress Panel, where she worked closely with the late Kofi Annan. Caroline, many people don't think of humanitarian work as addressing climate change as often as it actually does. And it was interesting yesterday to hear Gilles Carbonnier, Vice President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, say, you know, actually we humanitarians have been addressing the implications of climate change for decades. We just never framed it as such. So could you walk us through, you know, as a humanitarian, why this matters to you, in particular the 1.5 degree limit, and how you're seeing the effects of climate change in your work and how climate change is affecting your work?
Great, thank you.
And I'll just note that on the screen you'll see already some indications of that. We've got displacement as the really big answer in the room, but also water, food insecurity, migration, poverty, livelihoods, conflict, the list goes on and on. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for inviting us here today, and this is a really fantastic, varied audience. But I just want to say that we at CARE have been very concerned about climate change for a very long time. We're a development and a humanitarian organization, and I just want to make that point up front that I think that the dialogue here on humanitarian is essential because of the lack of connections in the past with climate change. So I think this is a space that we really need to focus more upon. But I'd also say that for us, because we do both development and humanitarian, the linkage of these two aspects is vital. Because climate change, you need to do something about adaptation and mitigation so that you don't have to do the humanitarian. So we have been involved across the whole spectrum of humanitarian and development in the context of climate change. And we very much support the Ipcc report about trying to keep the degrees to 1.5. We lobbied hard around the COP21, and everybody was happy that we said under 2 degrees, but it really has to be 1.5 degrees. So we see that climate change is really the greatest challenge facing humanity today. We feel that this is very, very important, and what's a big, big concern to us is that the effects of climate change are being felt all over the planet, but not equally. And we at CARE, we are driven by this sense of social justice, so what we really are driven by now is a sense of climate justice, a really beautiful term coined by Kofi Annan and Mary Robinson. And I think the climate justice angle is where we come in at CARE. I just want to give you 3 really important statistics, which we all know, but I think they're linked to some of the words on the board here. By 2050, the planet will have to feed 9 billion people. So I think that's quite sobering. And at the same time, we know that floods, droughts, and sea level rise, threats to water and food security, and the frequency of natural disasters will intensify. And it is estimated because of that, this will threaten to push another 100 million people into poverty over the next 15 years. So that's something quite sobering as well that I think we need to keep an eye on. And finally, linked to this displacement, the World Bank, who I used to work for, by the way, and the IMF, but great data, but they estimate by 2050 as many as 143 million people across 3 continents, 3 regions, Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, will become what they're stating are internal climate migrants. So these are people who are moving in their own countries, 143 million. This has huge implications for the work that we do. So I think what we would support very, very strongly is trying to keep within the 1.5 degrees, as I have mentioned. It has huge implications for our work. It has huge implications for how we operate as an organization, but fundamentally how we work and interact with the communities across the world. And I think what's very, very important today is to think about what are the dynamics at the community level, who has been affected and how. And what we see is that women and girls are the most affected across all these countries, whether it's a humanitarian situation or whether it's a situation of natural disaster and a drought. So you may not move or you may move, but your community and trying to survive in that community, you're going to have a tougher time if you're a woman or if you're a girl. And in fact, some recent research shows that women and children are 14 times more likely to die from disasters than men. So I don't want to I'm going to stop here, but I just want to say one more sentence. That is, I don't want to end on that negative sentence, because the women in the communities where we are working, they are the climate heroines. They are the ones that are managing, they are adapting, they are, in the family, managing the family, they're in the community, managing the community. And it's this focus that we need to really be more focused upon. We need to really understand the dynamics at the community level, because this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to work differently at community level. And it's an opportunity for us really to say this 1.5 degree at a global level is also achievable. But it requires, as we have heard from other speakers, for us all to live differently. For us to partner not just with governments, but with cities, with businesses, with communities and different social groups. So it does require a massive mental shift, but we're all mini ambassadors to try and ensure that we are able to contain the climate within this 1.5% degrees.
It's interesting to hear you talk about climate justice, because actually that is, you'll see it in a very fine print in the word cloud. Justice does appear in the bottom right, which I don't think would be the immediate thing that people would think of when you talk about the humanitarian implications. I'd like to turn now to Ambassador Elaine White, the permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva. She has also served as Deputy Foreign Minister. Ambassador, climate change, as we've well established now, is already affecting countries like yours. Can you give us a bit of a picture of what it's like in your country, but also in the region more generally?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. It is true that no country has escaped the impact of adverse changes in climate. Costa Rica, being geographically located in a region that is one of the most exposed to the consequences of climate change, being a straight isthmus between two continents and two oceans, or the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, climate change magnifies the socioeconomic and even environmental vulnerabilities that already this region has. As some strategic sectors such as agriculture and hydroelectric generation are specifically impacted by the consequences of climate change. So let me cite specific examples. So in Costa Rica, we are experiencing an increased frequency of extreme weather events, slow onset climate change phenomena, increased rainfalls, increased floods, prolonged drought during the dry season. We have dry and rainy season, so the droughts or the dry seasons are being longer, and we have a drought that threatens the energy generation in a country that relies heavily on, of course, on hydroelectrical power. We have then decreased agricultural production of certain crops, affectation of coastal areas due to sea level, to the increase of sea level, but also affectation of biodiversity equilibrium and ecosystem survival. Also, we have an increase in diseases such as dengue, malaria, and even Zika, due to the ecological environments that facilitate the generation of those mosquitoes. But let me cite just very concrete examples. During the last 2 years, Costa Rica has been impacted by two extreme phenomena. Hurricane Otto in 2016 and storm that then became a Hurricane Nate in 2017. This is very important to know. This is two hurricanes. Costa Rica has no history of previously being hit by hurricanes, at least in 150 years that in which data is recorded. Hurricane Otto, for Hurricane Otto, we had an estimated $300 million in damage, and we lost 14 lives. There were 4,000 evacuated families in Costa Rica and 10,000 in Nicaragua. But I think one of the problems is that when we see the difference between when we have hurricanes and hurricane alerts, everybody, I mean, they're in the media, and everybody's very alert to hurricane alerts. Or everybody's very conscious about hurricane alerts, but not so much about storms. And storms have even more intense effects in our countries, as we have more rain for a more prolonged period of time. So there's more affectation. In the case of the region, we have a history also of cooperation, intra-regional cooperation in order to react to these events. And in the case of Hurricane Otto, that actually affected several countries of the region, actually we resorted to a mechanism that we had created due to the Nansen Initiative and that later became the Disaster Displacement Platform, PDD. Under the auspices of PDD, in Central America, we had created a special temporary protection mechanism, some sort of a disaster displacement special protection or refugee status. So we were able to activate that during Otto for almost 200 Nicaraguans that had been affected by Hurricane Otto. And then we had, the following year, we had Hurricane Nate, that when it affected Costa Rica, it was a storm, which is even worse. So in a time span of 1 year, we had almost $1 billion in an estimated damage in a country that is that generates it has a GDP of 60 billion. Let me finish by saying that the Red Cross is at the forefront in our communities delivering first assistance. So it is very important that we analyze the role of these humanitarian organizations in these cases. And also, it is very important to keep in mind that most of the effects that we are seeing do not make it to the headlines. Also, don't be confused by the fact that we might not have many or much loss of lives, but it is because we have a very efficient and very strong system, to prevention and management system for emergencies. I will stop there.
Great, and I think we can talk a little bit more about that because it would be interesting to see what your best practice is. But first, I'd like to turn to Peter Felten, the Head of Policy, International Organizations and Multilateral Coordination at the German Federal Foreign Office's Humanitarian Assistance Team. Sorry, Peter, 1 minute. Peter coordinates Germany's contribution to the international humanitarian system, and he's also on the advisory group of the CERF, the Central Emergency Response Fund. Peter, if you'll bear with me. We're here to talk about how humanitarians should be adapting. How should donors be adapting to the humanitarian implications of climate change? And specifically, what are you, Germany, doing to try to change the way that you respond and anticipate?
Thank you, Heba. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's important to emphasize that humanitarian assistance basically wants to be last resort, and therefore I cannot emphasize more than has already been done on this panel how important it is that governments, with the help of development partners, prepare for mitigation and adaptation to climate change, so that in an ideal world, humanitarian assistance will have to come in only if the magnitude of a natural disaster is such that even the best prepared government, the best prepared administrations are unable to cope with it. Now, we know how difficult it is to prepare at that level, and we also see that climate change will lead to more natural disasters of a magnitude for which a single country simply cannot prepare. And so humanitarian assistance is necessary and will be increasingly, I guess, necessary in the context of the consequences of climate change. And the starting point for humanitarian assistance must then exactly be what Secretary General Assis said a couple of minutes ago, human dignity. Now, how to best preserve human dignity, how to best alleviate suffering, how to best save lives, is simply also for humanitarian assistance to act early. And the good news for humanitarians in the context of natural disasters is that thanks to the successes of climate science, we have already today quite reliable forecast data that is information that enables the humanitarians to act early. And therefore I'm so excited that climate experts, climate science experts and humanitarians coming together here, because this cooperation is so necessary to enable humanitarians to act early. Now, the information is needed, the forecast information. The organizations must be prepared to act early, and the organizations in cooperation with the donors need to ensure that the necessary funding, financing is available to enable them to act early. Because basically for the humanitarians it's kind of a moral obligation to make use of the information we have to act early. Taking this into account, Germany is working on the one hand kind of mainstreaming an anticipatory approach into humanitarian assistance, and at the same time also trying to help make the humanitarian system as a system fit for early action, for anticipatory action. We are systematically integrating early action components, disaster risk reduction components into the humanitarian projects and programs we are supporting, so that it becomes a normal and logical thing that humanitarian actors are not only reacting once the impact of disaster has been felt, but to work as early as possible to reduce this humanitarian impact. And when it comes to the financing side, we are working on the mechanism of forecast-based financing, and doing so with highly competent partners, in particular the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, the World Food Programme, and other organizations. Forecast-based financing, early financing for early action, so to speak. The forecast information for a natural disaster is there. Thresholds have been defined, and once these thresholds are being met, predefined humanitarian action is undertaken by humanitarian organizations, and at the same time, funding is made available so that the organizations, the humanitarian organizations, know that the early action they are undertaking will also be funded. You can do this, how should I say, on an individual basis as a donor country, but this is not sustainable, and therefore we are supporting funding solutions that are underway. The most prominent and the most early, definitely the DREF of the International Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, managed by the International Federation, but there are also initiatives like the START Fund for the humanitarian NGOs, and hopefully very soon also a funding mechanism for early humanitarian action in the context of the UN. And you mentioned that I'm in the SURF advisory group. We would advocate to use the SURF as such an instrument. Thank you.
Can I follow up with you, Peter, because Germany has been an early adopter of this, if not a pioneer of this forecast-based financing, and yet it wasn't exactly an easy sell at the beginning. And when the German Red Cross first developed this idea as far back as 2008, it struggled to get buy-in for it at that time, and it took many years until this idea kind of took on prominence. Why is it so difficult to get people to make these kinds of changes when the results and the benefits are so clear?
Well, they are clear for us. Maybe they're not so clear for the general public. First of all, humanitarian funding is always very limited, and there's always this impulse. If there is an actual need already present, you want to spend the funding to address that very concrete and already present humanitarian need. And of course, anticipatory action has an image problem insofar as if it is successful and if the need does not arise thanks to this anticipatory action or not in the same dimension, it's not so obvious to demonstrate that actually this humanitarian funding was exactly used for what it was supposed to address looming humanitarian needs. If they don't arise, very difficult to demonstrate that, that it happens. And on the other hand, of course, also humanitarian organizations need to be ready for that. And it's not exactly the same to react to the impact of humanitarian disasters which are already there, or to use this window of opportunity between a forecast and the impact happening to undertake early humanitarian action. So all this together takes time. Also, I believe in the field of forecasts. Still more can be done to make forecast data, climate data, even more reliable, and then to ensure that the different actors are really working together in a way that they understand each other, understand each other's needs, and that they work together in a way that makes it possible to take this concerted effort from data through humanitarian action all the way to the funding dimension.
I'd like to come to some of the questions that are coming up from the floor, and I'll integrate them as best as I can throughout the discussions. Ambassador Deo, there's a question here that I think you may be best placed to answer, and that's around, we have so many international organizations, informal initiatives dealing with this issue. There are science-based solutions to staying within the 1.5 degrees. You've got Project Drawdown, Exponential Climate Action Roadmap, 100% renewables, Solutions Project. I mean, the list goes on and on. So what's missing? Why aren't policymakers, governments, investors using these solutions that already exist?
I think you're absolutely correct when you look at the developing and more vulnerable states, and invariably you'll get the remarks that, or the concern that one of the issues that they face is the lack of finance. It's not really so much of lack of finance, because when it comes to the really allowing or giving finance is assessed as whether the projects are bankable and the risks are mitigated. I think that's where the problem is. The climate financing is assessed as a commercial financing. So one has to change the mindset that the normal criteria for assessment and evaluation of as a investment finance doesn't really apply to when it comes to climate financing, because we're looking at transformation of the model of our economy. So we really have to look at the way we perceive risk and assess risk, and also look at the way that the risk needs to be factored into when giving lending for climate finance. So that is where I think the mismatch is. While the funding may be available, the application of it or the uptake of it is not there, in the sense that the absorptive capacity is being questioned, and the projects are being assessed in the same assessment model as a business investment. So that I would say is the problem.
And there's a whole other dimension, which is, the specific, not only countries, but regions to which that financing is directed, which, as somebody has already pointed out in some of the questions, and we'll get to that a bit later, is often unequal. Caroline, another question linking one of the questions from the floor for you. This is kind of new and sometimes uncomfortable territory for humanitarians. And there are many questions, and Peter alluded to it earlier, about kind of where the limits should lie for humanitarians acting in this space. So on one hand, as we were saying, you know, this is a reality for humanitarians whether we like it or not. On the other, a humanitarian could very well argue, well, it's not my job to be doing adaptation and mitigation. Or, as one of the questions from the floor was, you know, should humanitarian actors be playing more of a role in advocacy, in raising awareness about the drastic effects of this? So for you, kind of where is the humanitarian piece in this wider value chain?
Thank you. I think that's a really good question. I think the humanitarian piece has been sitting on its own, in its own, almost like a sector. So doing really, really challenging and difficult work. But climate change does not sit in a sector. It affects everybody and everything. So for me, I would feel uncomfortable if we said, okay, this humanitarian sector here should now look at all the adaptation, look at all the mitigation. So I wouldn't advocate that. I would say that the development and humanitarian sectors need to be more aligned and speaking to each other. If we look at where a lot of control is, so we look at the World Bank, they don't do humanitarian work. And if we take other organizations like the UNHCR, they don't do development work. And I think there's a big realization of that. And that's why we see these organizations now trying to partner, trying to find ways so that there is not a gap. Because if you don't adapt correctly and if you don't mitigate, then you're going to have even more disasters. And my big concern at CARE is that our humanitarian system across the world globally is under huge pressure. We are at the moment trying to respond to many disasters. Added to that, many of the disasters are now coming in different countries of the so-called global north. That's actually crowding out the space for any other disasters that we are trying to tackle. This also crowds out funding. So when we have funding appeals, we'll find that, you've got your Hurricane Michael here, and then we're still trying to deal with the Indonesian appeal over here, but we just don't have the airspace to raise a fund. So we have an extremely crowded field. So I think the humanitarian space at the moment is one that is under a lot of challenges. I think you're right, we need to do things differently though in that space. I think it's been a space where we've tended to go in top down and sort of say, okay, this is, and there are reasons for that, but there's a big movement now about, okay, how do we work with local partners when we have a humanitarian crisis? And that's very important because it links back to how do we integrate at a community level? Who are we working with? How can we build structures and change power dynamics to enable the people who are excluded and more vulnerable to have a voice, even in a humanitarian crisis? So I think there's a lot of things that we would need to do differently to be able to be more effective. But I just want to make one other quick point, and that's on climate financing, if I may, from the previous question. So I think climate financing has not really been as effective as it could have been in the past. And the reality is, if you're sitting in a ministry in, the middle of Mali or the middle of Tanzania, you have 1,000 fragmented climate finance funds to try and get your hands on. When you finally get your hands on them, you may get like $3 or $4 million, and it's just so painful. So there is money out there, but the reality is it's extremely difficult to get your hands on. So there's a lot of money in the system. It's not a matter of money, it's a matter of just how do we get this system to work. So I just wanted to make that point there. Thank you.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on that, because there's another related question in here, maybe best for you, Peter. Shouldn't we also support local and national governments to implement their own versions of forecast-based financing? And linking to your point, how do we get this money into the right hands?
I think there's definitely a need for that, not necessarily from the humanitarian side, but as Carolyn emphasized, there needs to be cooperation between the development side and the humanitarian side. And on the development side, a lot is happening in that regard. looking at the World Bank and the different mechanisms that are being developed there, with the support also from German development cooperation, like insurance models. That is, models that help governments, that help authorities to get the necessary funding just in time when they needed to undertake preparatory action from the government side. And I still believe that given the scarcity of humanitarian funding, humanitarian should then come in only when all the possibilities from the side of the responsible governments and authorities have been exhausted to address the looming needs of their population first.
Ambassador Lin, I want to come back to you because Carolyn was talking about the need for humanitarians to do things differently, and you're also trying to do things a little bit differently in Costa Rica in managing the risk and in marrying the science that underpins climate change with better risk management. Can you walk us through how you're trying to take this forward?
Yes, I will do that, but I would like to start by mentioning two key messages. The first one is that in our case, we have decades of experience in managing risk and disasters. So we already have a platform, structures, institutions, coordination mechanisms, practice, public awareness. So what we have to do is to steer or to adapt that platform to the circumstances that climate change creates. That leads me to the other reflection, which is that it does take time, and that is our main concern. It does take time for a society to create this experience and to create platforms. I'm going to cite only two examples. Costa Rica now is known for having an energy matrix that is almost 100% based on renewable resources. 98% of our electricity is generated by hydroelectric projects. It took us 50 or 60 years. This situation that we enjoy today is the result of decisions and institutions that were created 50 or 60 years ago. We have around 20% of our territory that is protected under some kind of protection mechanism. It was also in the 70s that we created the legal framework for the protection of our natural endowment. So we do need to accelerate the pace, and we count on citizens, and especially the youth, to keep on pushing for governments to start taking action now. The sense of urgency, we can testify that it takes time, and we need to start acting. We are late, but we need to start taking the measures now, but because it takes decades. So after that, I would say that we have, with this decades-long experience, we have more than a decade ago, the country established a comprehensive government approach to tackle climate change and established interinstitutional coordination at the highest political level. Thus, most public institutions in Costa Rica have adhered to the National Climate Change Strategy and Implementation Plan, all under the broader framework of the National Development Plan. So we have incorporated climate change into our development planning, overall national development planning. And these policy instruments are drawn from solid data and science-based analysis. In terms of science and risk management applications and how we have incorporated them in the policy-making process in Costa Rica, we have both mirrored but also customized the international global parameters, platforms, and schemes that are created or agreed upon, such as the Sendai framework, and developed and implemented national plans, initiatives for risk management and disaster risk reduction, including early warning systems, all based on let's say, the global findings of state-of-the-art knowledge that we have. We have also improved, and this is something that is very important in dealing with the approach top-down or bottom-up approaches and the role of local communities and local governments. We have improved coordinated service delivery by our meteorological and the emergency system, and aligned effective communication networks to reach communities at risk, especially during crisis events. But I would like to underline that the role of local governments and local organizations at this point is absolutely fundamental, not only to provide first response to affected communities, but to support medium and long-term environmental and socioeconomic development and sound development. Two examples: in almost all communities in Costa Rica, we have what we call associations for community development. And those are the ones that play the role of the first response aid, and they constitute a channel or a system of communication and service delivery to the communities. But also the local communities are fundamental in planning for sustainable development at the community sector, at the community level. And one important challenge we are currently facing in the development of preventive measures, not only to increase the phenomena prediction capacity, but also through the implementation of mitigation and adaptation measures, including through smart rural and city development. For instance, as sustainable agriculture, landscape restoration, low-carbon transportation, and among others. Costa Rica has pledged to advance a low-carbon economy by 2021, which coincides with the 100th anniversary of our life as an independent nation. I would have to say that so far we are very efficient in the energy sector, but we have a lot of challenges in the transportation sector. That is where our main challenge lies. And that is why political commitment and solid technical and scientific criteria and access to state-of-the-art technology and financial resources are instrumental in the transformation of our country to a more resilient climate, to be more resilient to climate effects. And in this regard, we are very pleased to have received the news that we have received. Costa Rica is the first country in Central America to receive a specific project of $3 million for adaptation and mitigation from the Climate Fund. It is news that we received this week. So we have a combination of mechanisms that engage public institutions at the national and subnational levels. We engage the public sector, the civil society. We engage also, it is very important, the role of education, because we educate the children about the impacts of climate change, but also about the need to have sustainable management practice. So it is the children that actually put pressure on the parents to recycle and to engage in all these practices.
And I heard yesterday quite a passionate youth advocate talking about the need for young people to be at the table in these discussions, even here today. I see a few, but not all that many, so an important point. In the interest of time, because we're running a bit late, I'm going to wrap it up without a last round of comments from the speakers, but do find them during the coffee break. But this was really meant as an introduction to some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunity spaces. So I think we've heard about some ways forward, from forecast-based financing to the kind of whole-of-government approach that Costa Rica is employing, but also some of the ways in which I think many in the room are already recognizing that they need to do things differently, as Caroline was saying, and some of the obstacles to doing so, as the ambassador was pointing out. So I'm going to wrap this session up at that, and just remind you that you can keep putting in your questions into Mentimeter, and if you're having any trouble, do see the colleagues on the end of the table here, and some of them I have noted and will come back to during the day. Right now we are going to take a break. It was meant to be 30 minutes. I think if we can shrink it to 15, that would be best, just to try to bring us back on schedule. And before we do that, we're just going to have a quick sneak peek at the video art session that you can see in room 7. So here is a quick trailer of that.
Degree above. Globally, the world will warm substantially in the coming decades. It is estimated that the global temperature will reach 1.5 degrees above 1990 level in the next 20 to 30 years. What do these numbers mean? We are facing hurricanes, floods, drought, our food, our livelihoods, our families, our communities. We are already feeling the impacts. Here we can find the faces of 1.5 degrees. We can feel the impacts in our mountains and ocean, in our villages and towns. We can feel it in our spirit.
Je Stanley, j'ai 11 ans.
Je Vela Toussaint.
I'm Elise Pierre.
Okay, my name is Dominique Carbonis.
Non, moi, c'est moi Philistin.
My name is Guito Jean-Pierre.
Mon pam, c'est Phyllis Sinclair.
My name is Morali Joseph.
My name is Diana Lynch. We are the faces of 1.5 degrees.
To just stay here for a minute, that would be great. Thank you very much.